If the Ottomans had won this battle, who knows what kind of catastrophe would have rained down on the Christian world. That wasn't just speculation. That's literally what Queen Elizabeth I of England said about this historic clash. The battle we're diving into today was more than just a siege. It was the turning point that decided the fate of all Europe. I'm talking about the Great Siege of Malta, 1565. After conquering Constantinople in 1453 and effectively ending the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Turks catapulted themselves into superpower status, and from there they became an ever-growing threat to Christian Europe. But if they wanted to push west, dominate the Mediterranean, and eventually invade the heart of Europe, there was one thing standing in their way: Malta. This tiny island, smack in the middle of the Mediterranean, was way more than a patch of land. It was a strategic fortress, blocking Ottoman access between North Africa and the Italian peninsula. And even worse, for the Ottomans at least, it was the headquarters of one of the fiercest Christian military orders in history, the Knights Hospitalier. These guys weren't monks. They were elite warrior monks, and they had zero intention of handing over Malta without a fight. So Suleiman the Magnificent, the most powerful man in the Muslim world at the time, decided he'd had enough. He ordered one of the largest amphibious invasions the Mediterranean had seen since ancient times, not just to conquer Malta, but to wipe the Knights of the Order off the face of the earth. On March 22, 1565, the Ottoman fleet set sail from Istanbul. Nearly 29,000 troops were on board, 6,000 elite janissaries, 9,000 cavalry, artillery crews, siege engineers, you name it. The campaign was led by Grand Vizier Mustafa Pasha, accompanied by Naval Commander Piyali Pasha and several seasoned generals. On the defending side, just 8,700 men. That's it. And only about 700 of those were actual knights. The rest were a mix of local militias and mercenaries, all led by Grand Master Jean de Valette, the 49th head of the order. They had received word about the coming attack early enough to reinforce the island, setting up strong defenses focused around three main fortresses: Fort St. Elmo, Fort St. Angelo, and Fort St. Michael. But even with those preparations, Malta was on its own. Valette had sent desperate pleas for reinforcements across Europe, but got little to no reply. If there was any help coming, it wouldn't be fast. The Ottomans arrived off the coast of Malta on May 18th and immediately began planning their assault. After surveying the island, they made Fort St. Elmo their first target. From May 27th, the bombardment began. 30 cannons rained fire down on St. Elmo for 36 days straight. Massive Ottoman charges followed one after another. But incredibly, the defenders, vastly outnumbered, exhausted, wounded, held firm under Valette's orders. They knew surrender meant death anyway. On June 16th, the Ottomans launched a full assault on the battered fortress. The defenders, now spiritually prepared to die, charged out in a final stand. The fighting was savage. By the time it was over, nearly all 1,500 defenders were dead, except for a few who escaped or were captured. But they didn't go down alone. 8,000 Ottoman soldiers fell in the siege of St. Elmo, including half of the elite janissaries and the feared general Dragut, known as the Sword of Islam. His death was a massive blow to morale. The Ottomans had won, but they paid a heavy, demoralizing price. Next, Mustafa turned his attention towards Fort St. Michael and the fortified town of Senglea. On July 15th, he launched a two-pronged attack, a naval landing on the northern peninsula and a land assault from the south. But it was a trap. The Janissary boats moving in for the landing drifted into the firing line of 5 massive cannons hidden at Fort St. Angelo. The result? 800 elite troops were blasted into the sea in minutes. The land attack wasn't any better. Ottoman forces were repelled, and the fort remained standing. Furious at the failure, Mustafa ordered the deployment of 65 siege cannons and began an unprecedented bombardment of Sengleo and Birgu. Over 100,000 cannonballs were fired, one of the longest sustained artillery barrages in history up to that point. Then came August 7th. The Ottomans, having blasted huge holes in the walls with explosives, launched a full-scale attack on both forts. This time they managed to break through. Victory seemed within reach, but the defenders were unshakable. Despite being 70 years old, Jean de Valette himself led a counterattack at the front lines, inspiring both knights and civilians. His bravery was electric. Then, as if summoned by destiny, Knight Vincenzo Anastagi of the Order led a surprise cavalry raid into the Ottoman camp from the rear, slashing through the unprotected medical tents and slaughtering over 60 enemy personnel. The Ottomans panicked. They believed this was the arrival of Christian reinforcements from Sicily. Chaos ensued. They retreated. Now, quick quiz for you. Which of the following crosses is the official symbol of the Knights Hospitalier? Think carefully. We'll give you the answer at the end of the video. Back to the story. That failed assault on August 7th shattered Ottoman morale. From then on, cracks began to spread through their entire army. Supply lines were stretched, disease was rampant, and now more than a third of their force was either dead or dying. Meanwhile, the courage of the defenders was inspiring Europe. Word spread, and finally, on September 7th, relief arrived. A Christian coalition force of 8,000 troops assembled from across Europe landed in Malta. When they saw what the Ottomans had done, scorched villages, slaughtered civilians, they didn't wait. They charged, slicing through Ottoman ranks and driving them off the island. The Ottomans had arrived with 40,000 men. Only about 5,000 made it home. The Great Siege of Malta was a disastrous failure for the Ottoman Empire. But for the Knights of the Order, it was their most glorious moment. Their legend was sealed forever as the defenders of Europe, the bulwark of Christianity. And if they had failed, well, we might all be speaking Turkish today. Almost 4 centuries after the legendary Siege of Malta, another pivotal battle unfolded, this time not in the sun-soaked Mediterranean, but in the icy ruins of southern Russia. A battle that didn't just decide the fate of Europe, it helped shape the destiny of the entire world. I'm talking about the Battle of Stalingrad, 1942. After failing to capture Moscow in the previous winter, Nazi Germany realized that its blitzkrieg strategy, hit fast, win faster, had finally met its match. The Soviet Union was a whole different beast, a massive, cold, bloody beast. So, Hitler and his high command shifted their sights further south. They wanted to crush Soviet industry, seize the oil fields in the Caucasus, control the Volga River, and maybe, just maybe, break Soviet resistance once and for all. Their target? A once unremarkable city, now named after their arch-rival, Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, Germany launched Operation Blue, sending vast numbers of tanks, planes, and troops into southern Russia. And they weren't playing around. 800 artillery pieces, thousands of armored vehicles, and over 1 million German and Axis troops swept across the steppe. The attack on Stalingrad began with a literal firestorm. The Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet, led by General Wolfram von Richthofen, cousin of the famous Red Baron from World War I, obliterated the city from above. 2/3 of the Soviet Air Force was wiped out in days, and Stalingrad's skyline turned to ash, rubble, smoke. Still, the Soviets refused to back down. The Red Army held the line with bloody determination, but the Germans were making progress. By early September, they'd taken the northern and southern edges of the city. Soviet commanders, including Generals Vasily Chukov and Andrei Yeremenko, scrambled to hold the center. That's when the street war began. And when I say street war, I mean literally house-to-house fighting. Soldiers fought over basements, stairwells, and sewer tunnels. Snipers turned chimneys and attics into death traps. It was close range, brutal, and unrelenting. The Soviets had one motto: not one step back. That order, given by Stalin himself, became the rallying cry of the Red Army. They were fighting on home turf now, and the price of retreat wasn't just military shame, it was treason. Meanwhile, the Soviets were funneling everything they had into the battle: reinforcements, supplies, fresh troops, all brought across the Volga River under constant fire. But the Red Army didn't care. They held on. Even as 90% of the city fell into German hands by late October, the Soviets kept fighting. Now, here's the twist. In their obsession with taking the city, Hitler made a fatal mistake. He overextended his lines. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, was now deep inside enemy territory, with its flanks held by under-equipped Romanian and Italian units. And that's when the trap closed. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. 3 massive Soviet armies, nearly 800,000 troops, smashed into the German flanks. Within 4 days, they completely encircled Paulus and over 250,000 Axis soldiers in Stalingrad. It was a textbook pincer movement, and the Germans were caught with their pants down. Now imagine this. You're surrounded. Supplies are low. Winter is here, and the Soviet noose is tightening by the hour. So what do? You ask Hitler for permission to retreat. And what does he say? Nein, absolutely not. For Hitler, Stalingrad had become a matter of pride, a symbol. Retreating wasn't an option, not with the whole world watching. So he ordered Paulus to dig in and hold at all costs. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein tried to mount a rescue operation, codenamed Operation Winter Storm. He led 22 divisions of the German army in a desperate push to break the encirclement. But Soviet resistance was too strong. Their tanks, artillery, and air support were overwhelming. The rescue failed. And now, the clock was ticking. As the siege dragged on, conditions inside the German pocket grew horrific. Soldiers were starving, ammunition was scarce, disease spread like wildfire. Some even resorted to eating horse meat, and worse. By January 1943, the end was near. The Soviets launched Operation Ring, the final offensive to wipe out the German Sixth Army. Fighting was intense, but the Germans were in no position to resist. Finally, on February 2, 1943, General Paulus surrendered, against Hitler's wishes. It was the first time a German field marshal had ever been taken alive. Hitler was so furious, he posthumously stripped Paulus of his rank and refused to acknowledge the defeat for weeks. But the reality was unavoidable. Germany had lost its best army, over 300,000 men, and the psychological impact was catastrophic. The Battle of Stalingrad marked the turning point of World War II in Europe. From that moment on, the Axis was on the defensive. The Soviets, bloodied but unbroken, began a relentless push westward that would only end in Berlin. And here's the crazy thing. Just like the Knights of Malta centuries before, the Soviets had held their ground against a vastly superior force, turned the tide, and reshaped history. These battles, Malta 1565 and Stalingrad 1942, might be separated by 400 years, different weapons, different ideologies, but the core is the same. When everything is against you, numbers, weapons, odds, courage can still win.
Now for the final story in this trio of last stands, not in Europe, but in the steamy jungles and mountains of the Pacific. We're heading to the Philippines, January 1945, where Japanese soldiers made one of the most brutal and desperate defenses of the entire war. Welcome to the Battle of Luzon. By this point, the tide of war in the Pacific had already turned. After crushing defeats at Midway, Guadalcanal, and Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Empire was reeling. But don't be fooled, they weren't giving up. Far from it. The Philippines held major strategic value. It was the key to controlling shipping lanes, cutting off Japan from its southern empire, and staging the eventual invasion of the Japanese mainland. And Luzon, the largest and most important island in the Philippines, was the crown jewel. That's why, in early January 1945, the United States launched its boldest amphibious operation in the Pacific theater yet. The goal? Reclaim Luzon and liberate the capital, Manila. At dawn on January 9, the largest Allied amphibious landing since Normandy commenced. 70 battleships and cruisers opened fire, pounding Japanese coastal defenses around Lingayen Gulf. The sky roared with American aircraft, and the sea shook under the weight of heavy guns. But this time, the Japanese weren't waiting on the beaches. Instead of wasting men in futile resistance, Japanese commander General Tomoyuki Yamashita pulled most of his troops inland. His strategy was simple: lure the Americans into the jungle-covered mountains and bleed them dry in a prolonged guerrilla war. He had around 260,000 troops on the island, but while the numbers looked impressive, many of those soldiers were sick, undersupplied, and poorly armed. Japan's industrial power had been decimated. The army on Luzon was more stubborn than strong. Still, the Japanese were determined to make the Americans pay for every inch. The U.S. Sixth Army, nearly 175,000 strong, landed without major resistance. They fanned out quickly, advancing toward Clark Airfield, Baguio, and ultimately Manila. At first, the operation seemed smooth, but that all changed when they approached the capital. See, Manila wasn't just a city, it was a trap. Despite Yamashita's plans to avoid a fight in urban terrain, local Japanese naval commanders took matters into their own hands and fortified the entire city. They turned it into a death maze. Every street was mined, every building was a fortress, every bridge was rigged with explosives. And inside the city, around 17,000 Japanese troops, many of them from the Navy, were ready to fight to the last man. What followed was one of the bloodiest urban battles in the Pacific. For 29 days, American troops and Filipino guerrillas fought block by block, house by house, often against snipers, machine gun nests, and suicide attacks. Japanese troops refused to surrender, even when surrounded, even when wounded, even when out of ammo. And the cruelty didn't stop there. In what's now known as the Manila Massacre, retreating Japanese forces slaughtered over 100,000 Filipino civilians. Entire families were burned alive, hospitals bombed, priests and nuns executed, babies bayoneted. It was one of the darkest moments of the entire war. Eventually, U.S. forces encircled the city, cut off supplies, and moved in with overwhelming firepower. But the cost was high. Over 1,000 American soldiers died and thousands more were wounded. Entire sections of Manila were reduced to rubble. By March 4th, The city was officially declared secure, but the war on Luzon wasn't over. Japanese forces had retreated into the Sierra Madre and Caraballo Mountains, turning the dense jungle into a fortress. From there, they launched ambushes, raids, and booby traps against Allied troops. It was a nightmare. Snakes, mosquitoes, mud, snipers, and a fanatical enemy that refused to quit. Some Japanese soldiers held out in the jungle for months after the war officially ended. A few didn't surrender until the 1970s. Think about that. Fighting a war that's already over because your code of honor won't let you stop. It's wild, but it's real. By the time Luzon was fully secured, the U.S. had lost over 8,000 soldiers. But for Japan, the cost was staggering. More than 205,000 troops killed, wounded, or captured. It was the largest and bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. And it showed once again that even when defeat is inevitable, courage, or maybe obsession, can push people to impossible extremes. So now we've seen 3 great defensive battles across 3 very different times and places. Malta, 1565, where a few thousand knights held off the might of the Ottoman Empire. Stalingrad, 1942, where the Soviets turned a ruined city into the graveyard of Hitler's Sixth Army. And Luzon, 1945, where Japanese soldiers made their final stand in jungles and cities long after all hope was lost. Each of these battles is a testament to one thing. When you're outnumbered, surrounded, and running out of time, your only weapons left are grit, belief, and raw human willpower. They didn't always win, but they always mattered. So here's a question for you.